welcome aboard. This is our weekly partnership. And we've had a wonderful experience this winter partnering with the LST, the Silversides, and Muskegon Community College. So in many ways, while this is our class, and we really applaud these students who have enrolled in this class and been studying hard, they just turned in a big paper and George was really hard grading them. We got a lot of pouty faces, I think. But again, welcome to the community. Tonight's presentation is really special. Dr. Katharina von Kellenbach, she's going to talk about her research, a wonderful book that's on sale downstairs, The Mark of Cain, Guilt and Denial in the Post-War Lives of Nazi Perpetrators. And really look forward to having her share her story with you tonight. And Reverend Bill Freeman, he is our pastor at the Harbor Unitarian Universalist Congregation. He's going to talk tonight about restorative justice. Thank you so much tonight to our sponsors, Bob and Merle Skolnick. We really appreciate stepping forward and helping us put on these type of programming for our entire community. So Bob and Merle, thank you very much. Last week we left off with the race for Berlin. We finished the academic portion last week with the Battle of the Bulge. We learned, of course, that indeed the German advance was beaten back. And by late January, early February of 1945, in many respects the war was over. It was not a question of if, but when. But certainly Berlin had to be captured. And thus the Allied forces were marching in from the west. The Soviets were pushing back from the east. And Berlin was the prize. It was a race for Berlin. And what was found along the way would give credence to rumors that had been leaking out for the last year or two and ultimately horrify the world. And it was the series of camps, the various concentration camp, work camps. This is just a short map with a handful of some of the largest ones. These rumors had been just that, rumors of war. Was it true? Was it not? Were there such places? Were they just small places? And as both the Allies and the Soviets converged on Berlin, those rumors were being put to the ultimate test. And certainly nothing signifies more than the very gates of hell on earth than Auschwitz. We look at some of these photos. Nothing that we have not seen, most of us, unless you're a bit on the younger side, but the real purpose is to remind us what happened, and more importantly, so it can never happen again. Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding general of Allied forces, one of the things that he did upon occupation of German towns and camps was to march the German citizens at gunpoint and bayonet point if necessary through the camps to make them see what was right under their nose, to make them see what they did not know was taking place, to make them see what was right in front of them. And actually quite hard for anyone to do this, particularly Dwight Eisenhower of German descent. But really one of the very good things that he did was to force the German citizens to take a look at what was right in front of them. After the war crimes tribunals would take place. And this was relatively new, and thus throughout much of Germany, the Nuremberg trials would convene, and they were the most popular, the most common, the most spectacular, but as we'll learn later tonight, certainly they were the start of a 30, 40-year period and longer of war crimes tribunals. And the very idea of war crimes, how do you prosecute something that has never been precedented in history? How do you put someone on trial for crimes that in many ways have never been articulated through statute law, crimes against humanity? Ultimately, the question I think we're looking to answer and ask tonight is, how do victims, perpetrators, German and global society come to terms with their very, very guilty past? How do you reconcile this? How does the entire planet reconcile what took place during this war? And we're very lucky to have the best person in the entire country right now to help us weed through this. Dr. Katharina von Kellenbach. She's going to be joining us tonight in just a moment. She's a professor of religious studies at St. Mary's College in Baltimore, Maryland. She's a native of Stuttgart, where she studied evangelical theology at the University of Berlin. She came to the United States in 1983. She earned her PhD in religion at Temple University in Philadelphia. Previously, she served as a co-chair of the Religion, Genocide, and Holocaust group at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion. Currently, she's the chair of Christian Scholars Group on Jewish-Christian relations. Her areas of expertise include feminist theology, interreligious dialogue, Jewish-Christian relations in a post-Holocaust world. She's an author of numerous publications. Tonight she's going to share with us her most recent research, The Mark of Cain, Guilt and Denial in the Lives of Post-War Nazi Perpetrators. Again, a splendid read. We had this available, and we're so glad to have her here to share this and give us the introduction to it. Dr. von Kellenbach will explore how the practices of justice, forgiveness, and remembrance can lead beyond the devastation of the past and into new relationships between perpetrators, victims, and communities. Professor von Kellenbach will address us this evening via Zoom technology. So it's a new technology, and we are so glad to have Dr. Marilee Skallos here to usher us through this. Dr. Skallos is a curriculum design expert at Muskegon Community College. So much of what we do in our classroom comes from design experts. So her job really is not necessarily to work with the students, although she does, much more to help us as the faculty to increase our abilities. So as a design specialist, we're really thankful to have her there at Muskegon Community College. Professor von Kellenbach is going to talk about her saga of growing up in post-war Germany and learning of her family's deep and personal connections to the atrocity of the Nazi Holocaust. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katharina von Kellenbach.
I think I'm a little bit of an outlier because I'm not a historian and I'm not an eyewitness, but I come at this from religious studies, though dabbling in history, and I come at this as the second generation. Some of you in the audience are third and fourth generation, but I'm really asking sort of questions of meaning of this history and how this history reverberates through the generations and how we, how we remember some of, especially the most traumatic and atrocious parts of this history. So it's interesting that the title of my talk today is Forgotten Casualties. This was not my title, but I think it's a very interesting title to think about casualties, because I'm really looking at sort of the moral wounds of war in general, but of the Holocaust in specific. And I'm asking what those invisible wounds are and how these invisible wounds, what needs to happen for these wounds to heal, if at all, whether that's even possible, and certainly what it would take. So in my book, Coming Out of Religious Studies, I would say that taking a life, even in war, but certainly in Nazi Germany, taking a life generates guilt. So there are moral issues to war that I think we need to learn to speak about. And we oftentimes don't think about it. Oftentimes we think about the war and then it's over and it's peace and the veterans somehow go on living, but we don't really take the time to think about the moral injuries and what it takes to heal those. So here you see actually the book that was published last July. It took me many years to write, 12 years to write, and I will share a little bit of the of the findings. I'll share one particular story with you, but I also talk more specifically about what caused me to write this book, which really had to do with my own family history. So in the context of the Nazi Holocaust, we estimate that there was a total number of up to 500,000 men and women who were engaged in killing programs, which really need to be seen separately from war. I mean, war is also, as we know, about killings, killing of enemies. But the Nazi Germany is, of course, especially infamous for its various killing programs. And that includes, first and foremost, the Holocaust and the systematic destruction of Jewish communities all across Europe. But it also includes the concentration camps, where an additional 5 million people were killed for being communists, for being homosexual, for being Jehovah's Witness, for being Roma and Sinti. It also includes the euthanasia program, where people who were declared biologically, medically, or for other reasons unfit to live, unworthy of life, and a host of other things where agents of the state committed deliberate, intentional acts of murder on orders of their superiors. So 100,000 to 500,000 people who became guilty of murder. And then you look at the various trials programs and you see right away that the legal method of coming to terms with such guilt by necessity will be partial. So the international military tribunals in Nuremberg and the subsequent trials processed hundreds, thousands, in fact. There were 5,025 convictions. The United States issued 806 death sentences and executed 486. That's a dent in 500,000 men and women who participated in killing programs. There were also national trials in the Soviet Union, in France, in Great Britain, in Italy, Netherlands, and there were more people who were convicted. And then, of course, there's the Adolf Eichmann trial in Israel in 1961, and subsequently, really, the West German trials program started, and it is, in fact, ongoing. And I bring this up because my uncle was engaged or was exposed and then involved in these trials programs. But I want to start with the international military tribunals in Nuremberg and look at the ways in which the churches in particular engaged with those who were arrested and imprisoned and tried. Because again, I come out of religious studies and I believe very strongly that the justice system will never be able to try and convict and imprison everybody when it comes to crimes of the state. So the ministers and chaplains really went into the internment camps and the prisons with the Christian gospel, which is a gospel of forgiveness. And they preached. Now, many of the perpetrators, or I should put it this way, all Nazi perpetrators had been baptized Christians. I think that's something that one really ought to remember loud and clear, because in order not to be Jewish, you had to be baptized Christian, and your grandparents had to be baptized Christian, and Germany is in the center and the heart of Europe, so everybody was either Protestant or Roman Catholic. Some convinced Nazis left the Protestant and the Roman Catholic Church to become God believers. National Socialism never understood itself as an atheist movement. They always talked about God. Adolf Hitler talked about God, and he never left the Roman Catholic Church. He remained a Roman Catholic. Nevertheless, when the ministers then and priests then began to talk to them, they came with a gospel of forgiveness. And the Christian understanding of forgiveness is really tied in very unfortunate ways to a gospel or a message of forgetting. And the parable of the prodigal son is really sort of the paradigm of that kind of Christian forgiveness, which is to say, the father welcomes back the son and even chastises the older brother for bringing up the wrongdoing of the prodigal son. And it is as if the past trespasses are forgotten. He becomes, again, a member of the household. Now, in Germany, that was really the paradigm with which both democratic capitalist West Germany as well as the communist East Germany proceeded. They basically said, we will draw a line of closure, so-called Schlussstrich, behind May 8, 1945. You know, this is sort of a dividing line, and everything that happened before is over and done with, and we will start over. We are reborn. This is a new Germany that has nothing to do with what happened before. This is the so-called hour zero, right? Stunde Null. We are a new country. Whatever happened before is over. And the perpetrators, right, this massive number there that wasn't wasn't convicted, wasn't executed, sort of disappeared. And they tried to have a very low profile and to reintegrate and to reinvent themselves as respectable citizens of this new country. So I want to give you one of those who was converted and the way in which he spoke of what he had done and what Christianity meant for him as he did so. So this was Oswald Pohl, who was the economic head of the SS and as such responsible for the entire concentration camp system. And he had been baptized Protestant, then became a convinced Nazi, and then he converted to Roman Catholicism, and he wrote a conversion narrative called I Believe My Path to God, shortly before he was executed. So Oswald Pohl, he had overseen the entire concentration camp universe where altogether 11 million people perished. He designed and supervised the extermination by labor. He was convicted in the Nuremberg trials for crimes against humanity as well as war crimes. And then he converted in 1950, and by June 1951, he was one of 6 of the last convicts who were executed. Okay, so June of 1951 are the last executions. And by 1958, war crimes prison number 1 in Landsberg, where all the convicts of the Nuremberg trials were housed, was closed. So by 1958, everybody who had been sentenced and who had not been executed was released. Just to give you sort of a timeline, right? So within 13 years after the war, this incredible new program of the International Military Tribunal, which really developed new principles for international justice and handed down sentences and punished people. But by 1958, it was over. So here is how he talked about his conversion. And again, since I'm a theologian, I have to bring this up. He says, I have made a resolute and clean break with my previous life. Whatever was good in it, I have taken as uplifting memories into my reborn life. Whatever was bad, that which caused the minus balance, my innumerable sins, I carried humbly before God in prayer and fasting. That he took it from me, I feel as his immeasurable grace in my life. I want to point to 2 things here. One is the way in which this painting, which his wife actually made, separates, right? You can see this line of closure here. So underneath is the sword and books, rationality, right? And up here is the reborn, faithful person who is sort of ascending into the heavens. This is sort of the rebirth, you know, starting over again, and whatever happened before is left behind. that's one part which I'm sort of wrestling with in the book. The other part I'm wrestling with is this notion that God can sort of that guilt can be lifted, right? God takes it away. And the question is, okay, where does it go? That's sort of the question that I'm asking in the book. Now, the problem with Oswald Pohl, as well as with most of the Nazi perpetrators that I studied, and I read through hundreds of documents in the archives of prison chaplains, is that he did not see that he had committed any wrong. So when he spoke of guilt, he only put it in quotation marks. And one of the chapters deals with the last words, which were recorded in Landsberg, in the prison. And here's his last words that were recorded for him as he's standing under the gallows in June 1951. First of all, he says, "Long live Germany. For more than 30 years, I've served as a professional soldier, 22 years of which were with the Marines, i.e. the Navy." That's a mistranslation. "During this long period, the Americans were not able to prove or lay at my feet that I had given any orders or initiated any instructions which led to the persecution or execution of people, especially Jews. I die firm in the belief in God in 3 persons. God have mercy on my family, my faithful wife, and free Germany from its bad friends." That does not sound like contrition. That is an outright lie, considering that, you know, under his supreme command, 11 million civilians were killed in various concentration camps. And what that tells you is that his conversion and the forgiveness of sins left very little dent in his ideological conviction that he had done the right thing in terms of what his ideology had commanded him to do. And that is sort of the picture that emerges across these 8 boxes. There are 8 boxes called execution boxes in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., with a photograph of, you know, whoever is being convicted, as well as a record of their last words. And you can see the minister here. You know, the minister are always accompanying them to the gallows, and every single one, except for 3 exceptions, steps under the gallows and affirms their innocence. So I had to really wrestle with the fact that here are men who even profess to be converted, who are believers in God, who say, you know, here I step, you know, in the face of God, before whom I will be. I have done no wrong. I'm innocent. I die innocent. And, you know, how to take seriously the level of ideological faith that enabled them to ignore the suffering of victims in places like Mauthausen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz. There was no clear understanding of culpable wrongdoing. So I want to switch over there, and we can really talk much more about this issue and what the prison chaplains might have done differently in order to engage these men. And if I say men, I mean men, because of those 500,000 perpetrators, about 5,000 were women who served in camps as associates. So we can talk about the women as well, but the great majority of those engaged in the killing programs were in fact men. So again, after this first wave of executions, by 1958, the prosecution is over, right? They're all released. It's now 13 years after the war, and they're rebuilding their careers. Then in 1958 is the first trial in West Germany of Einsatzgruppen. And I should say that while Germany, West Germany in particular, was under US, French, and British command, or occupied country, they were not allowed to prosecute anyone except for crimes committed on German soil. But when they became states, they were given the legal authority to prosecute perpetrators themselves. And so the first of these trials was really in 1958. At the same time, there was a statute of limitations that came up. And so there were constantly political debates over what to do, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years after the war. Should we still be prosecuting them? Is it, all in the past? And then, of course, in 1961, the Eichmann trial occurs. And it is in that year, and I'm bringing this up because that's the year when my uncle was, in fact, arrested. And so I want to switch over into the question of what this does personally for families and how families dealt with this. Now, I myself was born in 1960. Let me do this here. These are my parents. They were married in November 9, 1959. If you want to do the math, I was born May 1960. And their best man at the wedding was Alfred Ebner, who I knew as an uncle. And we spent many weekends at his house. My father was very much admired him very much because he was a very successful businessman. He drove a Mercedes. His wife had fur coats. They had a very flourishing business. But then in 1971, actually, what I did not know, I found this out, when in the 1970s, somehow at a family gathering, I came across, or somebody sort of moved around the table, a newspaper article. If it was not, I don't exactly know how old I was. I might have been 11, I might have been 13. But I somehow saw this newspaper article about a mass murder trial. And I saw here his name, Alfred Ebner. And I saw the number 30,000 Jews. And I remember being at this table, young, 11, 13, and thinking two things. One was, why is Alfred Ebner sitting next to me at the table? Why is this not, why is he not in prison? Why is there no problem? Why would my parents be allowing me to sit on his lap, more or less, if he is in fact a murderer? The other thing I was thinking was, how does one person kill 30,000 people? What does this even mean? How does one even do this, right? I'm fairly young. I have not yet studied the Holocaust. And the third thing I was thinking is, who are Jews? Because I had never met a Jew. And that would be true for most people, not just in Germany, but also in Poland, in Belarus, in many countries. I mean, one of the consequences of the Holocaust is that there are no Jews. So in my case, I met my first Jew when I came to America. And that is, again, not entirely atypical. And it is one of the, quote, successes, right? Certainly one of the consequences of a genocide is that the people are gone. So I did not know who exactly a Jew is. I thought 30,000 was a crazy number. And I didn't know what that meant. How does one talk to, how does one relate to somebody who has such a secret? So most families, and again, think about the numbers, 500,000 men who were involved in killing programs. My family can't be the only one that lived with a perpetrator in its midst, fairly unbeknownst to most of them, or somehow there was a, forgive and forget. One somehow did not talk about this. So when I asked the first question, I was told, don't talk about this. This man has suffered enough. That was the quote. And you know, this is just not, you know, these are, and then the second thing was, these are all lies. You know, none of this is really true. You should not be thinking about this. So I eventually actually forgot this newspaper article because I couldn't make sense of it and nobody would talk to me. So it was sort of a buried memory in my mind that I had seen this piece, but I couldn't quite remember it until I came to America, until I came to meet Jews, survivors of the Holocaust, and their children. And I realized that they all knew exactly what their families had gone through, where their families came from, where their families were. They could tell me exactly, you know, from this town, and then this happened, and then that happened. And I knew nothing about my family. By then, I knew about the Holocaust, I knew history, but I didn't know where my family was in relationship to that history. And I understood that if I wanted to be in relationship with Jews of my age, I had to be able to answer that question. So I went back to the uncle who had given me this article and I asked, you know, why did you show this newspaper article and what did he do? 30,000, you know, where was he? Was he a concentration camp guard? What did he do? And I was given lies until I decided to go to the archives. I had to actually come up with a fake research project because the archives in Germany are protected for privacy and confidentiality reasons. So I had to make up a research project. I said I was researching something about partisans and I needed to get access to this archive. And so I found out that he was, in fact, the vice commissioner of Pinsk in Belarus, and that he had set up the ghetto in Pinsk, where about 30,000 Jews lived. And he had commanded this ghetto, including how much food there was coming in, how much forced labor they had to do, how many houses, you know, how many people would live in one house. And those were horrific conditions between May and its eventually destruction in the fall of 1942. And he oversaw the killing of about 30,000 people over the course of 3 days. So when I saw the indictment against him, I thought, I don't want to know this. I don't know how to deal with this emotionally. This is not knowledge that I can bear. And I understood for the first time why it is, in fact, difficult to know the truth, right? I mean, the truth can be a terrible place to be. And I understood why my family, my father in particular, who was enamored with him, and his wife and his children, and I'll come back to his children today, don't want to know this. So I'm throwing this out there and we can talk about this. The trial that he was involved in, he himself, I should put this back, he himself had one of the best Nazi lawyers in West Germany, Rudolf Aschenauer. He was already a defense lawyer in the Nuremberg trials. So we hired this defense lawyer, and like many in these West German trials, he was let go for what was known as biological reasons, right? It was a biological amnesty. In this case, they found a psychologist who diagnosed him with pseudodementia, not dementia, pseudodementia. And the expert testified that spontaneous improvement is possible as soon as the burden of the trial is taken from him. He faked, and everybody knew he faked. And as soon as the trial ended, you know, he could stop faking. So I never saw him especially sick. And this is taken about 5 years after the trial was over. And, you know, he was quite healthy. So he was the main perpetrator in that particular trial. and it was discontinued. And so then those who were left in that particular trial in Frankfurt were only the shooters. In other words, my uncle was of the middle management, right? He wasn't all the way at the top like Oswald Pohl, who gave the orders in Berlin. He was in the particular location, but he was also not necessarily the one, although he was in the end, but he wouldn't have had to shoot, right? Because he had then police officers and who would then do the shooting. So he would give the order to shoot 10 people, and then somebody else would, drive them to the location and then shoot them. So the West German system was struggling with who is the perpetrator and who is the accessory, right? The one who intends to kill is the perpetrator. The one who actually follows order is only the accessory. So they were really struggling with this, legally speaking. And as you can see in terms of the how many years, the sentences are just, they're offensive. But they are so low because they were understood to be only the tools in the hands of those higher up in the chain of command, right? So they were not responsible. They could not be held criminally responsible because they had not designed the killings. They were only the ones who held the guns. So what's also really disturbing is that, they treat each town as one case. And so the numbers in each, and they're actually, as we now know, all of those numbers were actually much higher. But, it becomes a completely dehumanized system of thinking about the killings, because each of those thousands of cases of people who were murdered becomes of cases, and they lead, to 2 years. And again, I think we can talk later on about, how to even feel about, Eckert, who kills 18,000 people and gets 3 years. And also, how he himself might have felt doing this. So I want to come back to the issue of how to deal with guilt, because I take this seriously, and it's very obvious that the punishment did not fit the crime. The punishment itself could not atone, to use a theological term, for what had happened. And so eventually I started thinking about the mark of Cain. And what I liked about that particular biblical story is that Cain lives a long life. And we oftentimes think about guilt as something that is either punished, right, and then it's done, or it's forgiven and it's lifted and it's done. And we don't really have good stories to think about guilt as something that is long-term. The mark of Cain, of course, kills his brother Abel and is then punished. And his punishment in the Bible is threefold. He was a farmer, but the earth no longer gives fruit. So he loses his professional identity. He's sent away from his parents to a new land, the land of Nod. And he's sent away from the face of God. And so he's at a distance from God. So there are three ways in which he's punished. But the mark is in fact not a stigma. The mark of Cain is in fact a protective mark. And so wherever he goes, he is protected by the memory, but he's also exposed. So he marries, his wife sees the mark. He has a son, his son sees the mark. He founds a city, everybody in the city sees the mark, and he becomes the ancestor of musicians and artisans and artists. So he leads a long life, a successful life, but he does so in the face of the memory of wrongdoing, right? And so that's really, again, if I can bring you back to the 500,000 men and women who became guilty of killings. You can't execute them all. You can't put them all in prison. They live long lives. They have families. They have children. How do we think about the guilt? How do we think about what they have done? So the mark of Cain, this is a photo by Georges Gros, where it's really an image of stigma. And it's also Adolf Hitler. The problem is, it wasn't Adolf Hitler. It was individuals. Every one of those killings was done by one particular person. That person has blood on their hands. How do they live with it? How do they speak of this over time? Another thing that I thought was intriguing was that in the Middle Ages in Europe, Germany and specifically, there's a tradition of marks of Cain where whenever there was a violent crime, the perpetrator was forced to put up a stone at the place where the crime had happened. So these are stones that, as you can see, they're not in a cemetery, they're not in the middle of town, they are in the middle of the woods, wherever a killing has occurred, to draw the memory of that wrongdoing to that particular place. And these stones, and there's in fact one in the middle of Berlin in Alexanderplatz, these stones were known as mark of Cain's. So I was sort of intrigued by that notion. What that means is that this guilt ought to be kept open, transparent. The memory needs to be an obligation that is upon the perpetrators, as well as their communities, because these were crimes that were committed collectively and communally. So in other words, these are crimes that involve me. So I felt it as my particular calling, and again, I'm not at all singular in that. I think there are many, there's always one person in German families who takes it upon themselves to commemorate what has happened. So I myself was discovered, I should say, over the internet by a Jewish family that went to Belarus. And they invited me to come along. And I was really very, very much interested, because Belarus is of the last communist country left standing. We've heard a lot about the Ukraine, but Belarus is really the one where you can't go in without invitation. It's sort of it's still a Stalinist country, and I couldn't travel there by myself, and I really wanted to go and see Pinsk for myself. Before we left on the plane, I wrote a letter to this family of survivors and the son of a survivor who had actually testified at the trial of my uncle. So there was a direct connection there between their family and my family. So before we left, they went actually by plane, and I wanted to go from Berlin directly by train. I sent them an email and I said, I'm very grateful that you're taking me along. And as you probably all know, some of them might not have known, I'm the niece of Alfred Ebner, who was responsible for the killings of everybody in this town. And then I didn't hear anything, because I guess they had already left. And in that silence, I felt the stigma, right? Where I felt, oh my God, how do I introduce myself? That's the only thing they know about me, that I'm personally related to somebody who killed, their entire families. What kind of an introduction is this? And I felt really kind of, I didn't even know the word for that. In any case, when we got there, we met the villagers in the little shtetl outside Stolin and Pinsk, where this particular family had come from, and there was a memorial service. And the evening before, I said, look, we are here to commemorate the victims. This is what we're there for. We commemorate the victims. We can't really commemorate the perpetrator. How do I talk about this? I think this should not be brought up because it's, it's too complicated. But one of the members of the Nosenchuk family, who was a former judge, said to me, if you think that what your uncle did was wrong, you should say that. And that if really cut through my heart, because I thought, what do you mean if? Of course what he did was wrong. How can this even be a question? But I realized that in that particular place, as a descendant of the people who had enacted these killings, I needed to go there and ask for forgiveness. It was the only language I could think of, knowing that it's the wrong language because I didn't do it, so I can't ask for forgiveness. They weren't there in some cases. In any case, they can't forgive me on behalf of the victims. It's too far away. And yet, the language of forgiveness was really the only way to express that a wrongdoing had been committed and that I, as a member of that community, understand that this was wrong. Because my uncle never, as far as I know, came to a place where he thought that what he had done was wrong. He was convinced that he acted as an agent of the state, that he had been given orders that he followed, and that these orders were in the best interest of Germany, to cleanse Germany of the Jews, to cleanse Germany of communists, to cleanse Germany of homosexuals, to cleanse Germany of the handicapped and the ill. They were convinced that this was the right thing to do. So it's these ideologies of nationalism, national superiority, of racism, of anti-Semitism that completely blinded them. And what I thought I would do as I was speaking there was to call on all of us. And we were in this particular place, I, as the embodiment of the Nazi heritage, we were the Jewish family, but we were also the Belarusian villagers who had come, who had also suffered tremendously under National Socialism. What I didn't know at the time when I stepped up there was that the Jewish men in that particular village had been killed by thugs in the village before the German soldiers even stepped foot into the village. So not only was there an issue of Nazi perpetration, but there were also issues of local perpetrators who had been known in that village for 50 years and nobody had ever talked about it. And I think because I had created a space to talk about guilt and what it means to live with the consequences of that, we could have this incredible dialogue over the issue of guilt and how to move forward in an open and transparent fashion. So again, I think we can talk some more about what that means. I want to end with a moment that really was a kind of a Steven Spielberg could not have done it any differently. As you can see, the entire week is hot and dry. When we came to this quarry in the middle of the forest, where on September 11, 1942, 8,000 people were shot in one day. So the Nazi Einsatzgruppen, and you actually saw this on the trial, on the verdict. It's one of those cases in the trial where they were convicted of. It took one day. They started at 8 a.m. in the morning, and they shot mostly women and children because most of the men had already been killed before over the course of one day. It is a place where the blood of Abel is crying out. There is a document that's part of the trial where the shooters, the executioners, are complaining about the noise, the stench, but mostly about the fact that they don't know whether they should first kill the child and then the mother, or first the mother and then the child, because those were mostly women and children that they killed in that particular place. And then they decide that it's easier to have the mother hold the child while they kill the child, and then to kill the mother. It is one of the most excruciating documents I've ever read. The first time I saw it, I forgot to copy it. I just couldn't take it. I just couldn't take it with me. It felt so dirty by this conversation. But as I was walking around, and you can see that this is a memorial now with around this quarry with these stone places. As I was walking there, this massive thunderstorm comes up, and I mean, this incredible the lightning and thunder and rainstorm comes in, and I was walking around this field, and the son of the survivor who had in the meantime died, who testified at the trial, also walked in this thunderstorm around this field. And I don't know what he was or who he was talking to, but I was talking to God, and I basically said, look, I mean, here's the moment. If there are any open bills, now is the time to strike me down with a lightning bolt, right, in a very magical way. And if not, then, we can consider this settled. But it was an incredibly emotional experience to actually do this in the presence of those who had survived and or who had lost families in this place, and to actually own this history as something of our own. So with this, I'm giving you sort of my own story as one way of not just talking about extreme guilt, right? These are extreme places of mass murder, but also to come to an emotional relationship to issues of perpetration. Because I think oftentimes when we think about traumatic histories, and every war is traumatic, but atrocities within war are especially traumatic because the victims are civilians. When we come to these places in history, we oftentimes detach ourselves, we disassociate ourselves emotionally from it. And I think we don't have a good language yet to speak morally about guilt for atrocities that humanize them, because the perpetrators of these extreme atrocities were not animals. They were not aliens. They were not demonic. They were human beings. They were evil. They did evil things. But we still are not helped by somehow making the Nazi into, these blonde and blue-eyed, black boot-wearing devils, because they weren't. And I think we do them an injustice, and we do ourselves an injustice not to take seriously how easy it is to fall into such situations of atrocity, and how hard it is to repair our moral integrity, both as individuals but also as communities. And Germany as a country now, I think, has struggled mightily with coming to terms with that particular history, finding a way to commemorate, finding a way to speak of this history in a way that is productive of justice, of human rights, of human dignity, and not to cut ourselves off. So, right in the 50s and 60s, they really thought the way forward was to just forgive and forget, cut it off, forget it, right, and not speak about it. I think that has changed dramatically, and now we talk about this history in a more, as something that we have to claim as our own as much as we claim the good parts. You know, Mozart, Beethoven, you know, I mean, that's a good part of Germany. The Holocaust is also part of Germany, and we have to learn to deal with this. So with this, I've used your attention long enough. I want to stop and open it up for questions and comments, and maybe have the other speaker add to this, and see what your thoughts are on this. Thank you very much.
In your book, you talk about examining the various chaplain interviews with the perpetrators as they're ready to be executed. Could you share with the audience a little bit about the consensus, how they felt their life was justified and their work as a perpetrator?
So this is talking specifically about Landsberg, where the executions occurred, and the chaplains really felt it their need to bring them to some kind of peace, right, and some kind of closure on their lives. And so they really tried to strengthen their resolve and their hearts, rather than confronting them directly with the utter devastation that they had committed. In part, it was also that these chaplains were, of course, also German men. They had fought in the war. And I think they didn't quite fully have sympathies, right? Their sympathy lay with their German compatriots who were now in Allied prisons, being convicted by what soon came to be known as victor's justice, right? So one of the deep flaws of the Nuremberg trials was that it only applied to the vanquished. Only Japanese and German soldiers and civilians, Nazi civilians, could be tried for war crimes. The Allied troops could not. And that incensed the German chaplains as much as it did the German public. And I throw this out here as a question on whether that's a good thing or not, because as a policy, we still have not signed on to the war crimes charter and made ourselves and our own soldiers subject to some of the principles. And I personally, I think that's a mistake. But you know, that certainly helped helped them to deny culpability because they felt that you know, they were being held to standards that, you know, and they could just dismiss it, and that was sort of the political climate at the time.
In the late 70s or early 80s, there was an American miniseries concerning the Holocaust. And American news reports suggested that was a watershed moment in West Germany. Did you experience that, or are you familiar with it?
Yes, I remember that vividly. This was in 1978. I was 18 years old. I lived in Bavaria, and Germany had at the time state TV. There was the first you know, the first and the second programs, which were national, and they refused to broadcast it. So it was shown on the third channel, which were local, territorial, you know, state-by-state channels. Bavaria, being a very conservative state, refused to broadcast the series. So people living in Bavaria could only watch it because Austria broadcast it, because Austria, as we all know, had nothing to do with the Holocaust. This was, of course, a German problem. So the Austrians had no trouble showing this, and so that is how, you know, we got to see it in Bavaria. In any case, I was absolutely, you know, determined to watch it. I started watching it, and my mother ran out the room and through the door behind her, very emotional within families, right? So that the younger generation wanted to see it, the older generation just became very passionate And then there were live discussions after each night of the series, and it really changed the entire perspective, because for the first time the Holocaust was seen through Jewish eyes. And remember, I had never met a Jew. I had very little imagination of what it meant to be Jewish, or what that history might have felt like. At that point, I had learned about 6 million Jews, right? But 6 million Jews is, just as 30,000 Jews, that's nothing. I mean, what you need is one family, because that makes it human. And the Holocaust was an exercise in dehumanization, right? What the Nazis had accomplished ideologically, politically, was to dehumanize Jews until you felt no human connection. And even the executioners, this was like executing, I don't know. I mean, they did not look at them as human beings. And so what this miniseries did to an entire nation was it rehumanized Jews as, ordinary families and people who suffered. And it created compassion that had been completely deadened and eradicated by this event. So it was very, very important.
Thank you very much for your presentation here. I think there's a event that happens in many countries, like our own American experience with not accepting the fact, or at least the southern states, that there was atrocities perpetrated on Negroes. And I hear you saying that Germany is still, or many Germans are still not accepting the fact that there was atrocities committed on Jews?
Well, I think the knowledge is out there, right? But what is still missing is the personal realization. And let me give you an example. So my uncle had 2 children. One was born in 1941, his son, and the daughter was born in 1943. They actually lived through the trials. I mean, my uncle was sort of going through several trials throughout the 1960s, so they were already adult. But they deny his culpability. So when my book came out last year, they also refused to talk to me, as you can imagine, because I was the one who dug it all up and who published about their father and sort of brought to light what had happened. So when my book came out, my father actually brought it to them, and I told my father, tell them that I can help them deal with this emotionally. So he told him that, and the son said, I don't need emotional help because my father was a good person. He helped many Jews. There's the lie, right? And so that's a denial of atrocities in the interest of maintaining one's illusion about one's family members. Because, it's easy to say that other people are evil. I mean, everybody knows the Nazis were evil. There's no debate there. But my uncle is not evil, right? My father cannot be evil. Therefore, he can't be a Nazi. You see the logic behind this? And most people don't think rationally about it. It's an emotional response. And in the process, the atrocities themselves get sort of beautified, whitewashed. I mean, they're gone. Because if his father was a good person who helped many Jews, where are the 30,000 Jews in Pinsk? Why is there no Jewish community in Pinsk left when he was in charge of that, right? So revisionism and the denial of Holocaust is rooted in the attempt to not face, you know, you know, not being able to deal with this. And to some extent, you know, I know his father much better than he does, because I spent more time thinking and digging out what his father, you know, the most traumatic experiences of his father, I've been there. He has not. He can't face it. So I would understand this. I mean, there's politics involved as well, but I also think it's important to understand the psychology of facing atrocities and why it's so easy to, you know, to beautify and whitewash history in order to maintain the goodness of the people we feel close to, we love. They're our family. There's also no getting rid of family, as we all know. Right? So even if I hate the guy, he's still my family. So it's that sense of being stuck with that that makes it sort of tricky history.
Excellent. Some other questions?
So, Doctor, the Jewish family that you were with, did the Jewish family that you were with, did they forgive the perpetrators? And the other question, a two-part question, sorry. In today's society in Germany, are they studying about the Holocaust?
So the way the Nosenchuk family dealt with this was interesting. They kept saying, look, your uncle was a bastard, but, you know, we love you. So they tried to sort of say, you know, just forget about him. Because, you know, he was evil, but you're different. And of course I am different. I understand that too. But I want to resist sort of writing them off out of humanity. I mean, they're still human, and we have to come to terms with their humanity and the fact that they are members of our families, my family in particular. So they, you know, I don't know that was forgiveness either. I mean, we had a wonderful time, and they were very and are very supportive of my work, and I think the fact that we went there together was really, in my language, redemptive, right? I mean, it was something. There was a moment of healing there. The fact that we could cry together, we could mourn together what had happened, you know, which does not undo it, because there is no undoing that particular history. But by mourning together, it was something that brought us together in the present, right? We are now that what has been rendered asunder can be brought back together, and we can be together, even though our histories are separated. I didn't fully understand the second one about Germany. Are you asking whether kids learn about the Holocaust in school?
Yes, please.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Again, I think my generation was the first generation to learn about the Holocaust in school, and in part, that was Allied policy. The Allies basically shut down 20th century history in the schools, and they did so, and if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because who were the teachers? You really did not want the teachers in 1950 teaching about National Socialism, because they were National Socialists, right? So they just said, let's not talk about it. So there was no history for the generation that then rebelled in 1968, right? When you think about the student revolution in Germany, those were the generation that was born during the war, that came of age, you know, in the 1950s and 60s. And they had received no education whatsoever about the 20th century. It was completely silenced. When I then had history education, I got the first generation of new teachers, right, who had gone to university and graduated, and there was sort of the beginning of history lessons in school. Now, what we didn't know, and this is only coming out now, is that those teachers went to university and had professors who themselves were Nazis. I mean, so the continuity, I mean, it actually takes really a while until certain ideologies are flushed out of a system. But still, I mean, they try to teach it. I compare my exposure to the Holocaust with sex education, which also came in at the same time. And I don't know what kind of sex education you had, but we got the facts. But none of the feelings, right? And now understanding that, you know, anybody close to you might possibly be involved in this, right? I mean, nobody you knew did that. So that was kind of how we learned about National Socialism, right? We got the facts, but you also knew that you wouldn't be going home. Oh, let's put it this way. You did this once, right? You came home from school and you said, oh, we learned this today. And the conversation about dinner around dinner table would be so explosive that you never brought up this topic again. Just like sex education. I mean, whatever facts you learned, you didn't talk about them around the dinner table.
I was at Dachau when it was liberated, and I know that your families can look back and wonder how they could do that. Well, I know every now and then when I think of it, in the furnace room, here was 2 huge piles of bodies just stacked up like cordwood. Out on the railroad tracks, there were several boxcars with the doors popped open and the dead just falling out. So I can imagine you thinking of your family, how they could. I know just, you know, I don't think of it often except like when you're talking about it tonight, but what an awful thought that must be for the people. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, I grew up in Munich, and so part of my history education was, in fact, a trip to Dachau. And it is, of course, now a museum with these images, right? These photographs. So I was exposed to these photographs. I must have been 16, maybe. And again, I could not go back to my family and talk about this, right? Because, I mean, the denial, I mean, people were so emotional about this and they felt immediately accused. Now, maybe I did accuse people, I don't know, right? But I don't think I accused, but they felt defensive immediately, as if I had accused them. So the level of defensiveness around even the images, right, and the history was very, very intense. And I remember, you know, as a next generation, I mean, it's sickening. These images are just, you know, they're very, very disturbing. And we, as the next generation, did not get any kind of help, you know, on how to process this as young people. And I think that has changed. I think the generation now, of course, you know, school classes will go to Dachau, they go to Buchenwald, they go to Ravensbrück, they go to Auschwitz. I think this generation now, including my children, are now getting some kind of framework to try to, you know, to try to understand how this happened and what this means and what they can do to make sure that it doesn't get repeated. Because I think that's very important as we teach these histories, that we don't just teach, you know, that we don't just, that the students don't just feel powerless. I mean, it's just so, these atrocities are just so depressing and they make people feel powerless and to some extent almost cynical. So I think it's very important that, and when we teach this history, that we give students the tools to make something better out of this, right? I mean, some commitment, you know, some understanding of what led to this, why this happened, and what they can do to make sure that it does not happen. So I think that's really very, very important in teaching this history.
Well, I was wondering about the perpetrators and how they felt. Did they feel like they were just doing their duty, or did they feel that they wanted to do this for Germany, or were they just following orders? What was their mentality, I guess, is my question.
So even under Nazi law, sadism was a crime. So if you enjoyed killing, if you enjoyed torturing, you could end up before an SS court. Now, their definition of enjoying torturing, they were of, I'm not trying to defend SS, justice here, and their categories. But so what that meant was that for the majority, I would say, they very much tried, they did not torture and kill out of enjoyment. But they felt, they tried to be very technical and cold and detached about what they were doing. At least that was the outward image that they tried to give. And I think that that is probably true from what we know about torturers and executioners, because of course Nazi Germany is not the only country with genocides and gulags and prison camps where torture happens. And what we know about perpetrators of such state violence, the majority of them are not sadistic, and they don't derive personal, whether that's sexual or other pleasure, out of inflicting pain. But they inflict pain in a very clinical way, and they're trained to inflict pain in a clinical way. So to some extent, in their own minds, it was that they were professionals, right? And they had a job to do, and they liken themselves. But National Socialism is a racist ideology that's rooted in biology. And many medical doctors, there was no profession that was as Nazi organized as the medical doctors. And all the camps had medical parts, including research on human subjects was performed in concentration camps. And they understood themselves, just like a surgeon cuts out a cancer, right? So you cut into flesh, you inflict pain, but you do so for the greater good of the patient. And the pain you have to inflict, which doctors do, certainly without pain medication, the pain that they inflict, they do so not because they enjoy pleasure, not because they enjoy it, but because they have to do it. And that's kind of the professional ethos that they try to see themselves in. And it's also why then they felt that they hadn't committed a crime, because it was their professional, they had performed their professional duties. So, the men that were convicted in the trial against my uncle, they were all police officers after the war. And they were police officers in Pinsk, in Belarus. And so their job as police officers was to kill 8,000 people in one day. That's how they saw their jobs. Police officers use violence, right? They have guns, they have clubs, they have dogs, they have horses in every country. Police officers don't enjoy inflicting pain, but they do it as part of their jobs. And so that's how they did it, except they went into mass murder.
Talk to us a bit about your book. Upon reading this book, what will we learn? What are some of the things to look for? And please sort of introduce us to your book before we depart here, please.
Okay. So the book is basically different stories. It's built upon the mark of Cain, to the extent that what I liked about the story is that Cain is a young man, a middle-aged man, an old man, a father, a husband. And so each chapter advances the problem of guilt from the 1940s and the international, those prisoners who were convicted by the Allied forces, into the 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s. And I wanted to tell the stories of particular perpetrators, how they talk to their children, how they talk to their wives, whether their wives were guilty and complicit, both during the war as well as after the war. And then the last chapter is really about a perpetrator he was the youngest one. He was born in 1925. He became an SS man as a 16-year-old, was sent to Buchenwald and then to Majdanek, which is a death camp. And he was part of the Majdanek trial, which happened in the 1980s. And so he's the one who dealt the longest with sort of this legacy of guilt. And I basically wanted to tell the story of how they spoke of their own past and how they came to live with that history. Mostly, I think it's fairly readable. It's not technical, because also coming out of religious studies, I think that religious studies, we have to find a language to talk about guilt and forgiveness in a way that makes it more than what's going on in confessionals. I mean, these are political issues that we all struggle with around the globe. And I wanted to give people examples to think about perpetrators, in South Africa, in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Abu Ghraib. We deal with these men and women as our neighbors, and we need to find ways to relate to this guilt and the way in which it's denied. So that's what the book is. I hope that people will read it and take some hope from this, despite all of this. I mean, I think it's, in many respects, it's a very disturbing book. It's a very disturbing history. But it's also something that I think we can live with, that can become our history, that we can move forward into the future.
Well, I think it's a fabulous book, and I've had the privilege of reading it. I really encourage others. And before we let you sign out, every time we say that we're out of questions, if we could impose on you for one more, Rabbi Albert would like to ask one more question if you could. Sorry I missed you earlier.
I don't know if this is fair, but if you could talk about theology either from your perspective or from Catholic Church or the various Protestants, I think there's not much time, but if you, and it may be just at this point it's too short a time, but is there any way you can talk about your understanding or Christian understanding of theology related to this period?
I mean, one of the themes that is also in the book is that Christianity, as I said, every perpetrator was baptized by definition. So this is, in fact, a Christian problem to deal with, that Christianity did not just not prevent the mass murder of Jews, but in fact actively helped it, because Christianity has taught that Jews killed Jesus, that the Pharisees tripped up Jesus. I mean, on and on. We are inundated with anti-Jewish stereotypes. And so part of the task for Christian theology is, in fact, to rethink its relationship to Israel, the people of the so-called Old Covenant, right? The Old Testament and the New Covenant, the New Testament, and to think very deeply about how to recast that relationship in positive terms, so that Jews are not, so that the teaching of contempt, what has been called the teaching of contempt of Jews, that is part of Christian theology, is changed and becomes a teaching of respect. So how does the Christian message of the gospel become a teaching of respect for the mother faith? And I think since 1945, in both the Protestant as well as the Catholic Church, there has been a tremendous movement to think critically through the Christian teachings toward Judaism, our liturgies, our art, our music, our teachings, and to really take seriously that Jesus was a Jew, all the disciples were Jewish, and that when this Jewish message of the God of Israel was spread among the Gentiles, that one should not understand that as superseding the covenant with Israel, but in fact as grafting in. I just spent the weekend talking about Romans 11, where Paul speaks of grafting in the Gentiles into the olive tree that is Israel, so that we really need to think about how Judaism and Christianity can see each other as brother or sister faiths. I want to make one specific example of that, and that is that in Judaism, for God to grant forgiveness, the wrongdoer has to go to the victim to ask for forgiveness. In Christianity, there is no place in the liturgy where the perpetrator or the sinner has to in fact go to the one who has been wronged and ask for forgiveness, because the priest or the minister can grant absolution in the name of Christ without consulting the victim. And I think that that was a huge problem with the ministry, because these chaplains could pronounce absolution without thinking about the victims, without forcing the perpetrators to confront the suffering that they had caused in the life of the victims. And when one reads the Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, you still have these places where it says, before you go to the altar of the Lord, go to your brother and ask for forgiveness. So we still have these Jewish notions of repentance and forgiveness in Christianity. But I think when we begin dialoguing with the Jewish tradition, there is much to learn and to sort of dig through our traditions and get a better understanding or a different understanding of how forgiveness and reconciliation actually works. So one of my pleas theologically would be that Christians take seriously the victims of wrongdoing in our liturgies, and that we do not base forgiveness on forgetting, especially when it comes to forgetting the victims, right? It's very easy to just forget the victims and pretend as if, it's all done, parable of the prodigal son, we can start over and we don't have to worry about it. And I don't think that is genuine grace, to use a theological term, right? That is, within Protestant theology, that is cheap grace. And grace is not cheap. It takes effort.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your story tonight. And again, a wonderful presentation learning about the concept of justice. And justice is very contiguous with our society. Virtually every society on the planet has justice systems, and they're all unique to the culture of the system. And thus we look at what is justice. Well, here in the States, we tend to wrestle with two primary issues of retributive justice and restorative justice. What is retributive justice? Well, this is actually the justice we're most familiar with. Merited punishment in a rubric of proportionality. Quite simply, when your brother kicks you, you kick him back. That's what I was taught. And I've got 3 brothers, so I've got lots of sore legs.
Back up real quick, please. And the key with retributive justice is that it's often the punishment must fit the crime. And we hear an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Please. And Mahatma Gandhi probably tells that best, is that when you trade an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, you end up with lots of blind people. So focusing on just a retributive justice is very, very limiting in our society and really in any society. And that's what we learned tonight, the whole concept of restorative justice, which is part of really every justice system. So what is restorative justice? It's the healing of breaches. How does the victim and the perpetrator heal that breach? Because we've got approximately 2 million people incarcerated in our society today. And unless you execute them, they're going to come back into society, and thus they need to reintroduce themselves to society. How do we heal the breach between the victim and the perpetrator? And that's not something we've been overly successful with in our society. And that has to do with our justice, has to do with our culture. So restorative justice asks different questions. Who's been hurt? What are their needs, and who's responsible for making things right? Focusing first and foremost on the victims, but not exclusively. Because indeed, as we learned with the last presentation, the perpetrators are indeed self-inflicted victims as well. And it's hard for us to extend our concern to the perpetrators, but they're just as much a part of our society. So we think of restorative justice, it's really a victim and offender type program that has to balance the needs of the community. And every community is different, but how do we promote justice in our community that promotes healing? And that's really the challenge still 70 years after such atrocities, dealing with this on the smallest level in our society. So tonight we're very pleased to have Reverend Bill Freeman here tonight to talk to us about restorative justice. Reverend Freeman is the pastor at Harbor Unitarian Universalist Congregation here in Muskegon. He earned his master's degree in divinity from Western Theological Seminary in Holland. Bill has marched for peace, lobbied Congress to pass hate laws, crimes. He's lobbied the state legislature to pass anti-bullying legislation, and he's been arrested for civil disobedience in his support of marriage equality. A man who really embodies, in my opinion, the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, the right to protest for right. One of Bill's first personal philosophies is that he believes that we're all put on this earth to give each other a hand when things are going well, and to give each other a hand when things are going bad. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Bill Freeman.
I have to say I feel kind of like the little leaguer following Babe Ruth, but Lee Daniels, the butler, was out a few months ago, and I saw that, and maybe you did too. It starts out with slavery and how slaves were treated badly by whites. And I'm sitting in the cinema carousel watching this, and I felt compelled. I didn't do this, but I felt like I should stand up and turn around and say, you know, to all the people of color here, I would like to apologize to you on behalf of white people for the way our ancestors treated your ancestors. I was born in a Catholic hospital. I'm a Protestant minister, but I think maybe I got some Catholic guilt along the way. In the same way, I feel like I should apologize to Jews because, as it's been pointed out, all of the Nazis were Christians. And I never have understood people who say, I'm unapologetically Christian. Really? You're unapologetically Christian? You don't want to apologize for the Crusades or for the Nazi Holocaust, for the Salem witch trials? You don't want to apologize for, you want to be that'd be like saying I'm unapologetically white. I want to apologize for some things white people have done, and probably I've done in the past. But anyway, well, I want to talk to you tonight about restorative justice and forgiveness, and how it's important for the forgiver to forgive as much as the person being forgiven, I think. As you may know, Lent is underway. Lent is a time in the Christian calendar for self-reflection, self-examination, and self-denial sometimes. Lent leads up to Good Friday and Easter Sunday, when Christians commemorate the death and resurrection of Jesus. Lent starts with Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday begins 40 days of fasting and prayer, not counting Sundays, reminiscent of Jesus's 40 days of fasting and prayer in the wilderness at the beginning of his ministry. Ash Wednesday is when many Christians get a cross of ashes on their foreheads, as you know, to demonstrate their repentance. Ash Wednesday is preceded by Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras features carnivals, parades, people doing wild and crazy things. Here in the United States, the most famous Mardi Gras is probably the one in New Orleans. In the world, the biggest observance is in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where 2 million people take part in celebrations. Mardi Gras is French for Fat Tuesday, a time for people to give up and get rid of fatty foods like punchkis, if you have any. Now, I want to say that I did my part for Fat Tuesday. I bought some Bavarian cream powdered and chocolate covered punchkis. In fact, I'm such a dedicated observer of Fat Tuesday that I started on Fat Monday and continued for several fat days after that. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe in giving up things for Lent, just not Bavarian cream powdered and chocolate covered punchkis. Lent is like a do-over for those who've broken their New Year's resolutions. If you resolved on New Year's to give up desserts, but since New Year's have indulged in cookies, cakes, and pies, Lent is a time to reconnect yourself to your New Year's resolutions and try again to give up cookies, cakes, and pies. While I don't believe in giving up things like cookies, cakes, and pies, or punchkis, I do believe in giving up things for Lent like bitterness, resentment, and hatred. Bitterness, resentment, and hatred stem from the inability to forgive. It's easy for us to tell others to forgive, to give up their bitterness, resentment, and hatred. For somebody else to do that, it's easy for us, but what's hard is for us to give up, to forgive, and give up our bitterness, hatred, and resentment. What's even harder is to forgive and forget. I know the professor said we can't forget, and we really can't until we maybe learn from what happened to us, but I think it's important that we put things behind us. Oh, come on now, Pastor. I might be able to forgive, but I'll never be able to forget what that person did to me. It's hard enough just to forgive. Do I also have to forget? Nelson Mandela was an expert on forgiveness, having spent 27 years in a South African prison, put there by a racist apartheid regime. But then, somehow, he managed to forgive those who put him there. Nelson Mandela says, if you hate your enemy, it's like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. Nelson Mandela didn't just talk the talk, he also walked the talk. When he got out of prison, he forgave his enemies. He reconciled with his enemies. He was elected president, South Africa's first black president, and he invited those from other political parties to join his government. In 1993, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Nelson Mandela understood the importance of restorative justice, forgiving and reconciling with our enemies, those who have wronged us, those who have hurt us. Yes, he started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which investigated human rights abuses under apartheid and brought people to justice. But he knew that black South Africans couldn't hold on to bitterness, resentment, and hatred toward white South Africans. So, to the extent humanly possible, Nelson Mandela and other blacks in South Africa had to forgive and forget what was done to them under apartheid by whites in South Africa, partly for the whites, but mostly for themselves. Nelson Mandela knew that if blacks were unable to forgive and forget, it would have hurt their own hearts, injured their own spirits, damaged their own souls. It's easier to go over our pain caused by others than it is to get over our pain caused by others. How do you get over the pain caused by others? Now, I have to say that compared to what happened at the Holocaust, what I'm talking about is somebody who wrongs you, somebody who sins against you, as opposed to somebody doing evil against you, which obviously was done in Nazi Germany, obviously was done against slaves in slave times. But how do you get over the pain caused by others? You just do it. How do you quit smoking? You just do it. How do you quit drinking? You just do it. How do you quit using other drugs? You just do it. Of course, all of this is easier said than done, but when you think about it, everything is easier said than done. To stop having bitterness in your heart, resentment in your soul, and hatred in your spirit, you do the same thing that people do to stop smoking or to stop drinking or to stop taking other drugs. Now, it might take a 12-step program to help you stop smoking, drinking, or taking other drugs, but eventually you just have to do it. You just have to stop. The same thing is true with getting over the pain caused by others. You might need help, counseling, support of some sort, but eventually you just have to stop being bitter. You just have to stop being resentful. You just have to stop being hateful. They say when we forgive and forget, it's not so much for the person who has wronged us as it is for us. If we hold bitterness in our heart, resentment in our soul, and hatred in our spirit, it doesn't hurt anyone but ourselves. We can't completely live until we can completely forgive. Spiritual people know that forgiving and forgetting is crucial to living soulfully alive, to living fully alive in body, mind, and spirit. Dr. Wayne Dyer has a PhD in psychology from Wayne State University in Detroit. He's written more than 40 books, most of them about self-improvement and more recently about spiritual development. He's had a 15-year relationship with public broadcasting. Whenever he writes a new book, he goes on PBS and they offer it as a premium for people who donate during a pledge drive. He was on PBS recently with his latest book, I Can See Clearly Now. It's basically his memoir. He writes, "I came here from a divine light, and there's nothing anyone can do to put out that light. This is who I am, a piece of God, who hasn't forgotten that God is love, as am I. And his love has been tested. His father abandoned him and his family when Dr. Wayne Dyer was just a child. As a result, he spent most of his growing up years in orphanages and foster homes. He never saw his father again. He tells the story of how years later, after his father had died, he went to his father's gravesite. He was going to do something to his father's grave that I really can't repeat here. Instead, he was inspired to forgive his father. He says it was like a weight was lifted from his shoulders. He then went to Florida, holed up in a hotel for 14 days, and wrote his first best-selling book, Your Erroneous Zones. Dr. Wayne Dyer says he wouldn't have been able to write that book without first forgiving and forgetting the pain his father had caused him. We all make mistakes. Hopefully we learn from those mistakes and we become better people. The reason we need to forgive others for their mistakes, for the mistakes they've made, is because we make mistakes too. We have to forgive others for their mistakes, and we have to forgive ourselves for our mistakes. As the professor pointed out, the Nazis were human beings, just like we are. And the evil they did is in each one of our hearts. We have to fight against it, but they're not a different species. They were human beings, as are we. Religious people call mistakes sin. Not evil, but mistakes. Sin. But sin simply means missing the mark, falling short of perfection, making an error. When people in the business world make a mistake, they learn from their mistakes and accept those, and then they forget them. They move on. They certainly don't dwell on them. Henry Ford went broke 5 times before founding the Ford Motor Company. R.H. Macy started 7 failed businesses before he founded Macy's department store. Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard and started a failed business before he founded Microsoft. We all make mistakes. That's why we have to forgive others and ourselves for mistakes. No matter how many mistakes they make or we make, we have to forgive. And it's good to forget too. Otherwise, we'd hold it against them or us. Instead, we need to repair our relationships with others and sometimes ourselves. We need to restore our relationships, to engage in restorative justice with others and with ourselves. Jesus seemed to enjoy his Last Supper with his disciples the night before he was crucified. The Last Supper is remembered fondly as a time when Jesus ate the Passover meal with those whom he had called his friends. But were they his friends? Actually, the Last Supper for Jesus was the 23rd Psalm for Jesus. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now, wait a minute, Pastor. Are you saying the disciples were his enemies? Well, think about that for a moment. It wasn't just Judas who would betray him. Peter would deny him, and they all abandoned him. They all ran away. How could they do that to Jesus, the man who taught them how to love? And what would the man do who told Peter and others to forgive 77 times? Would he be able to do that himself? After he had been tried, convicted, and crucified, while he was hanging there from the cross, the scriptures say that Jesus looked at those who put him there and said, God, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Perhaps when he said that, he was also thinking about his disciples, the ones who had betrayed, denied, and abandoned him. Perhaps the man who said, forgive and you will be forgiven, knew that he couldn't just talk the talk, he also had to walk the talk. Perhaps by doing that, it allowed him to restore his relationship with his disciples, to engage in restorative justice. Jesus is telling people why God forgives them for the mistakes they've made, for the wrongs they've done, for the hurts they've caused. Because people don't know what they're doing. If they knew what they were doing, if they knew all the ripple effects of their wrongful acts, if they knew all the pain they were causing, if they knew all the people they were hurting, they wouldn't do it. as we've heard, people lie to themselves when they do wrong. They think they're doing their government's work. And we don't have to go way back to Nazi Germany. I mean, how many people have been tortured, as was mentioned in Abu Ghraib? Evil happens even in the present day. But too often we don't think past the next 10 seconds. We don't think about the consequences of our actions. We don't think about the impact on others sometimes. We don't think about others, period. But the good news is God knows people aren't perfect. They're human. If God had wanted people to be perfect, God wouldn't have made people humans. God would have made people angels. And even some angels have fallen, as we hear. And God loves people in spite of their mistakes, because God is love. God's love for people is unconditional. They don't have to earn it. It just is. It's like a parent's love for a child. The parent loves the child just because the child exists. That's why I believe all people go to heaven above and maybe even live in heaven on earth. But no one goes to a non-existent hell below. Now, some people might live in hell on earth of their own making, but God doesn't send anyone to hell because God is a supreme being, not a supreme bully. Plus, forgiveness is one of the messages of the Scriptures. So how could humans be expected to forgive and then God not forgive? Spiritual leaders have known for many years the importance of forgiving and forgetting, of restoring relationships, of restorative justice. We can't live in harmony without forgiveness, without restoring relationships, without restorative justice. Henry Ward Beecher was a 19th century preacher. It's said that he developed a theology of God's love above everything else. Henry Ward Beecher knew the importance of restorative justice. He proclaimed, "I can forgive, but I cannot forget," is only another way of saying, "I will not forgive." Forgiveness ought to be like a canceled note, torn in two and burned up, so that it can never be shown against one. Can we tear up and burn that kind of metaphorical note? Mother Teresa founded the Missionaries of Charity in India. She spoke about and demonstrated love and forgiveness all around the world. Mother Teresa knew the importance of restorative justice. She explained, if we really want to love, we must learn how to forgive. Is that a lesson we have learned yet? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was called the father of the civil rights movement. He spoke often about the beloved community. Dr. King knew the importance of restorative justice. He maintained forgiveness is not an occasional act, it is a constant attitude. Do we have a constant attitude of forgiveness? Lent is the perfect time to think about giving up bitterness, resentment, and hatred, whether you're a Christian or not. That's what Nelson Mandela, Dr. Wayne Dyer, and Jesus were able to do. That's what countries have to do collectively after war. When they're not successful at it, it usually leads to another war. Do you have people that you're having difficulty forgiving for what they've done to you? Do you have people that you can maybe forgive for what they've done to you, but you can never forget what they've done to you? Do you understand the importance of forgiving and forgetting, of restoring relationships, of restorative justice? I know it's all very difficult. Believe me, I know this. But I also know that if we cannot forgive and forget, if we cannot restore relationships, if we cannot engage in restorative justice, it's not hurting others, it's only hurting us. Let us lift our spirits. Spirit of love, may we forgive others for what they've done to us. May we also, after learning whatever lesson was involved, forget what others have done to us. May we strive to restore those relationships. May we seek restorative justice. And may we pray that when we forgive and forget what others have done to us, that others will forgive and forget what we have done to them, forever and ever. Amen.